Colonel Carl Gauthier, MMM, CE, was born and raised in Montgomery, Quebec, and holds a degree in history. After having been an air cadet, he began his military career as a cadet instructor, while he completed his studies before serving for nearly 5 years in the Wing Heritage Officer, as the Wing Heritage Officer at 3 Wing Bagatelle, Quebec, where he contributed to the opening and operation of Bagatelle Air Defense Museum. He has been employed as what is known as the Directorate of Honors and Recognition at the Department of National Defense in Ottawa since 2002, and has been the Director since 2013. Please join me in welcoming Lieutenant Carl Gauthier.
Thank you very much. Recognition and honors have been a passion of mine since I was in the Air Cadets a long time ago, and so I do not know what I know because of the job I have, but I have the job I have because I know what I know, if you follow me. So tonight we're going to be talking about military recognition, the structure that we have in Canada now and its various components. But before we do that, of course, we're going to do a little bit of a historical background or check as to what was used to recognize military service before we created our modern honor system. Go a little bit over the nomination process, how it works, and then of course at the end I will take some questions if you have any. So do not hesitate to interrupt me during the presentation as we go along if you have specific questions. Otherwise, if you have any generic ones, we can wait for the end. So, starting with a bit of history here, the concept of recognition, of course, is not new. We know that in the Western cultures, the presentation of physical insignia to be worn to recognize physically distinguished people who had done some amazing work goes back a long time. We can look back at the history of Greece and ancient Rome and find that soldiers were awarded various wreaths as well as some medallions to be worn on their armor to signify the gallantry they had displayed in combat or the leadership they had displayed leading battle. Of course, there's a whole concept of chivalry in Europe, and then the more modern decorations for merit and campaign service, which came about mostly in the 19th and the 20th century. Now, focusing on Canada, of course, our First Nations always had a concept of honor. However, they are not in the honors in a physical sense that we understand them now in terms of medals hanging from ribbons. But of course, they had great warriors who distinguished themselves in battles, and they had ways to recognize that, to acknowledge this bravery displayed in the face of the enemy. And that took in some cases, physical forms that included, for example, facial tattoos and some ornaments on the dresses and the clothing, and also the presentation of the famous eagle feather, which was a great honor usually earned in battle. But there were also non-physical forms of recognition, such as the title of chief or simply the place of honor that one would be given in the community, and the respect that was paid to them. They had the right to speak first and were recognized as an authority in the group. So that concept was very much present in Canada well before the arrival of Europeans. Of course, what is now called Canada during the 17th and the 18th century was in part occupied by France, and the new French system made use of royal French honors. And mostly it was l'Ordre Militaire et Royal de Saint-Louis, better known as la Croix de Saint-Louis, the St. Louis Cross, that was used to recognize Canadians who had distinguished themselves in battle, but also in the administration of the colony. And you have an example here in the center right of an insignia of knight of the Royal and Military Order of St. Louis. About 300 Canadians were actually admitted to this order, which was founded back in 1693 in 3 grades, knight, officer, or commander rather, and Grand Cross. And so that was used, And Canadians, even after the conquest, after the British took over, some people who had fought on the French side continued to be recognized after that date through that order by the French government. Now, of course, as the time went by, Canada became British, and of course we started to make use of the British honor system, especially from the time of Confederation onwards. We made use of the full range of British honors in terms of peerages, knighthoods, as well as decorations for gallantry, campaign service, and military long service. Especially, like I said, from the 1850s and 60s onwards. So our veterans who served in the Boer War, in the two World Wars, as well as in Korea, received decorations such as the Distinguished Service Order, the Military Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, you know, the Mention in Dispatches, Companion of the Order of the Bath, and things of that nature, which were part of military culture in Canada for that entire period. Of course, we've had difficulties in our experience with the British system, especially on the civilian side. The military system is, you know, works pretty much as it still does nowadays, but there have been some political issues that have surfaced, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, concerning the use of British honors in Canada. Most of these honors were nominated or were put forward by the Canadian government, sometimes by the Governor-General, sometimes without telling the Prime Minister, which caused some irritation in some cases. Prime Minister Laurier in 1902 was quite upset when Mr. Shaughnessy from Montreal, who was a president of the CPR and a great enemy of the Prime Minister, was elevated to the peerage as Lord Shaughnessy on the recommendation of the Governor-General, but without the Prime Minister's knowledge. It didn't help that the Prime Minister heard of the news in the newspapers, as opposed to hearing it from his Governor-General. So Wilfrid Laurier at that point said, very well, from now on, all honors will have to be approved by the Prime Minister. And of course the colonial office, that was still looking to us a bit like a colony, we were a dominion by then, but still, sort of oohed and awed, and they said, well, yeah, we'll sort of respect that, but they were a bit inconsistent in that practice. As time went by, that rule was generally followed, and then the First World War occurred, and there were a few cases of honors that were debatable. You know, Sir Sam Hughes, you may know of him, famous or infamous, should I say, for the Ross Rifle issue and management or mismanagement, some will say, under his tenure as Minister of National Defense. Eventually, he was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath, and this attracted significant criticism. The blow really came, however, when Sir, I forget his name, Graham, his last name was Graham, was elevated to the peerage as Lord Atholston in 1917. Now, this chap was the boss of the Montreal Star, and he was very unpopular. And some people said he was undeserving, and others said that he was both unpopular and undeserving. And this is an appointment that had been made not only without the Prime Minister's knowledge, it had actually been made against the Prime Minister's advice and against the Governor-General's advice. So the British actually went forward while all the Canadians were saying, not a good idea. And that is the straw that broke the camel's back. Because at that time it became quite well known, of course, that the British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, was actually selling honors. You know, if you made a contribution to his electoral campaign, you could receive an honor. The bigger the check, the higher the honor. So a small check would get you, you know, a CMG or something like that. Something slightly bigger might get you a knighthood, and if you're really generous, then a peerage, of course, is an order. It was actually a price list with the matching honors that existed. Of course, that was slightly unsavory to most people, and there was a huge debate in Canada, and there was certainly an impression, if not a reality, that some of these honors, such as the one to Atholston, was actually bought. fair and square, if we can say that, and not deserved or earned. And so ensued resolutions in Parliament and directive from the Prime Minister, who was born at the time, and eventually, after much more debate, a report by a special committee of the House of Commons. And the end result was that honours were going to stop in Canada. Originally, the idea was to make sure that we're not going to have hereditary honours, like peerages, bestowed upon Canadians. And of course, in the political debate that ensued, the distinction between knighthoods and peerages being lost on most politicians, the proverbial baby was thrown out with the bathwater, and essentially all honours were out by the end of this debate, save military honours for gallantry. So the Victoria Cross and things like that were still safe, but any other honour were essentially out, and that was in 1919. So our soldiers were recognized, and there were knighthoods, including, Sir Arthur Currie and some people who contributed to the war all the way to 1918 and 19. But once that was all over, then the tap was shut off and the fount of honours went dry for a number of years. Of course, the Nickel Resolution, as it is called, because it was introduced by the Conservative MP for Kingston, who was named Nickel, and the report to the House of Commons was followed by a motion in the House. Well, a resolution and a motion, they don't have the force of law. They basically express the opinion of the House at any given moment. So it was never a rule, an order in council, or an actual act that there shall be no peerages or knighthoods or honours to Canadians. But the question was so contentious that most politicians just steered away from it. And it's only Prime Minister Bennett in the 1930s that actually proved that it could work. And he used the honour system a little bit like what Prime Minister Borden had suggested: no peerages, but all other honours, including knighthoods, but not selected based on political affiliation, but really selected based on merit. And the Prime Minister consulted the Lieutenant Governors, a number of other people, and built an honours list that actually was very, very well received by the general public and Parliament when it came out in 1934 and 35. It included 18 knighthoods, and Sir Frederick Banting was among them. Lucy Maud Montgomery was a CBE, and there was a number of other honours. Sir Thomas Chappet, a famous French-Canadian historian, was on that list. And these people were from very broad range of activity, all political stripes, and the list was very well received. The sad thing, of course, is that although Prime Minister Bennett had a very good idea and made very good use of the honour system during his tenure, he did not have quite as much luck with the economy. This was the Great Depression, and of course, when there was an election again, out he went, and Mackenzie King came back in. And Prime Minister Mackenzie King had a great phobia of honours, except when they were for himself. And so when he came back in, the tap was turned off once again, and that was the end of honours, both British and foreign to Canadians, for a while again. Then we come into the Second World War, and our Canadian forces become engaged. We go to Europe, and we are in combat. Of course, it's clarified from the start that all gallantry honours are fine, but nothing else, which quickly puts our forces at a great disadvantage because our colleagues from Australia and New Zealand and India and Britain are being recognized with OBEs and MBEs for meritorious service away from the front or other types of contribution which are not available to Canadians. And so it took a long while for the government to come around, in fact not for the government, I should say for the Prime Minister to come around on this issue. It was not until 1942, so 3 years into the war, when it was actually decided very well, we will allow the non-titular levels of the orders of chivalry to be used. So not the knighthoods, anything that comes with a Sir or Dame is out, but CBEs or CBs, the CMGs and everything below, that works. And that's what we used until the end of the Second World War. It was better than nothing, of course, but again, it left Canadians at a great disadvantage, especially for the higher ranking officers. You have people who are generals commanding, huge formations in combat, and they have their colleagues being knighted, and made Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath, and you name it. And our Canadians are eligible. The highest thing they can get is a Companion of the Order of the Bath, which usually goes to a brigadier. And when you're a 3-star general equivalent, that doesn't quite cut it. And we had to be quite inventive, and in fact we made use of the Order of the Companions of Honor, which was never intended when it was created in 1917 to be used for military service. It was supposed to be used for public service, science, the arts, literature, and things like that. But that's the only higher non-titular honor that we could actually use, and people like General MacNaughton and General Treyarch were appointed to that order to sort of fill that gap. 1945 comes. There's one civilian list of honors that the Prime Minister lets come out in 1946, and then the font runs dry again. And then Korea happens. And then, of course, there's oohing and awing, and it's quickly decided, okay, we're going to just use the policy we used in the Second World War. And we had Canadians recognized there with OBEs and CBEs, and Brigadier Rockingham, for example, received a Companion of the Order of Bath for Korea. 1953 comes around, and once again, that's it. The Canadian forces are out of recognition, and Canadian civilians, essentially, except for that one list of post-war civilian honors in 46, and that small window in 34, 35 by Prime Minister Bennett, there's been no civilian recognition for military service since 1990. None at all. And so in we go into the 50s and 60s, and there's ongoing debates about creating actual Canadian honors. And some things are done. Although it's not strictly speaking an honor, our first foray in that sort of field is the Memorial Cross, which we created in 1990. It's a memento, it's not a decoration, to recognize the widows and the mothers of those who had fallen during the Great War, a memento that still exists today. Then we had to wait until 1934, where King George V created, on the recommendation of the Government of Canada, a long service medal for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. During the Second World War, we created our own Canadian Service Medal to encourage volunteer service, the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal. The Canadian Forces Decoration, our long service decoration, we'll talk about it a bit later, was created in 1949 and replaced a whole host of different British long service medals and decorations, which varied depending on if you were an officer or an NCM, if you were Army, Navy, and Air Force, and if you were a permanent force or a reserve or auxiliary forces. It was quite complicated, and they all had different criteria, which made administration a complete nightmare. So the CD, 12 years for everybody who wears a uniform, made things a lot simpler. And then the Korean Medal in 53, although it looks very much like the British one, the Canadian one is actually created on the recommendation of the Government of Canada. The obverse is different. It has the word Canada on it. It was paid by the Government of Canada, made in Canada out of silver, when the Commonwealth one was made in the UK out of cupro nickel, and had been created by the King when ours was created by the Queen just after she ascended the throne. So they're quite distinct. So these were first forays in the field of honors, but again, there was great reluctance about the political implications of getting deeper into this, especially if we mention civilian recognition. We have the same problem as in merit when we look at bravery not in the face of combat, not under fire. And we continued to use British honors for that purpose, including for civilian cases, all the way into the 1960s. And so we used the George Cross, the George Medal, the Air Force Cross for aerial rescues, for example, as well as the Gallantry division of the Order of the British Empire. And we were just talking with some people here who actually know the last Canadian who was made an MBE for Gallantry in 1968, Nurse Cashin, for attending to a crash site of a Czechoslovakian airplane that crashed in Gander in that year, and did a tremendous job rescuing people in very awful conditions. So we were still making use of those British honors as we needed, really, but as time went by, there was a greater intent to move away from that and create something Canadian. It's just that nobody could agree what it would be. At National Defense, since the Second World War, to try to fill that huge gap in recognition, we have been pushing proposal after proposal to create, a whole host of decorations especially for merit, including schemes for a 5-level Canadian order without knighthood attached. But all of this came to naught because as soon as it reached the Prime Minister, the wall came down. As you may know, there was one medal that was created after several attempts, the Canada Medal. The Prime Minister finally relented, and they created one medal called the Canada Medal that was going to recognize everything, from military service to gallantry in the field, from heads of state to the private in the trenches, and of course it was entirely, impractical to try to recognize all areas of merit by one single award. However, a list was made up, and of course when it got to the Prime Minister, he could never make his mind up. He never signed it, no medal was ever awarded, and the whole thing was cancelled when the Order of Canada was created 25 years later. So we find ourselves in the 1960s when Canada's national identity is growing, and we're trying to do more things of our own, and we're looking at national symbols. And as you know, Prime Minister Pearson pushed a number of those initiatives, including the new Canadian flag, which was adopted after much acrimonious debate. And once that was established, he decided to turn his attention to honors and to solve that issue. Of course, Prime Minister Pearson had served in the First World War and earned medals there, and had received an OBE himself as a diplomat back in the 1930s list. So he knew about honors, and of course he had served in the British High Commission later on, and knew how the British system worked and how Canada found itself at a disadvantage because he was part of all those debates about honors, and of course was influenced a little bit by his then boss Vincent Massey, who had been pushing also since the 1940s, and especially as part of the Massey Commission in the 50s, to create a Canadian order. So all of this to say that we launched into this finally in 1967 on the occasion of the Centennial of Confederation. So before we go there, just to give you a brief overview of the structure that I mentioned in terms of gallantry recognition for the military under the British system. So you can see the Victoria Cross, of course, at the top, created during the Crimean War in '56, retroactive to '54. And then it's organized by level. So the top level is service neutral and rank neutral with the VC. And then as you go down, level 2 is dependent on rank and service. Rank in terms of the DSO for officers, although 3 services combined. Other ranks have different medals, so the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal, Navy and Air, and the Distinguished Conduct Medal for the Army. And then at level 3, then you have 2 levels, one for officers, again different based on the 3 services, and medals for the non-commissioned members, and of course the mention and dispatchers at the bottom. So as you can see, it's a fairly complex system, but it really illustrates the society in which it was created. The British society in the late 19th century and early 20th century was very much still a class-oriented society where it really mattered. If you were an officer, usually you were from the upper classes, and usually the non-commissioned members were from the working classes, and there was this clear distinctions that were established there, and that is reflected here. And most of this has endured in the United Kingdom until 1993. When all of the gallantry recognition system was streamlined to become entirely rank neutral at all levels, and service neutral at all levels except at level 3, where the DSC, MC, and DFC were conserved only for traditional reasons, but they're now open to all ranks in those categories. So, back to 1967, Centennial, great occasion, Expo 67, and all the celebrations that went with it. This is the pretext that was used to create our national order. And it was, very unique because of the experience we've had with the British system, and when we compare with other systems like the French, and we'll mention that in a few minutes. This was the genesis and the cornerstone of what became a very complex and complete comprehensive honor system that you can see reflected on the poster over there on the easel. If you can actually see it. But initially the Order of Canada was supposed to be in 3 levels, but then again, when it got to Cabinet, the memories of the earlier debates and the attempt to try to avoid any possible idea of class distinction or elitism or anything like that made it impossible for the Prime Minister to push for a 3-level order. And so he had to backtrack and agree to a one-level order, the level of companion. So it was going to be one level for everyone. And at the last minute, they added what was called the Medal of Service of the Order of Canada, which was essentially like a second level, but it was disguised as something else, with a Medal of Service and a Medal of Courage to cover all the gallantry aspect. And we'll talk about that a bit later on. So that's what started it, along with the first Canadian commemorative medal in the form of the Centennial Medal, created in the same year. And so that was the nucleus of the honor system that has grown since then. So the aim of the system, as it is now, of course, is to recognize all fields of endeavors of all people. And our system is based on what the person has done and not who the person is. Unlike some of what we saw in the British system and what we see in many other countries. So merit is the base of everything. And of course, the honor system helps to highlight people who've made a great contribution, create role models, emphasize and promote certain values, help with national unity, pride in the country. So, basic principles are as follows. The Queen is the font of honors. And that was insisted upon by the King in 1947 when he signed the letters patent constituting the office of Governor General, that was one thing that the King was not willing to delegate to his representative in Canada. He wanted to remain the font of honors. And in Canada, to this day, official honors are only created by and awarded on behalf of the sovereign. So that is the first rule. Anything created by another authority is not an official honor. They are awards, and we'll mention some later, but they're not official honors in the forms of orders, decorations, and medals. Insulation from politics. So I told you about the whole problem that we had during the First World War, and even before then. And in order to avoid that, what the Prime Minister did, which was very unique, and still is in many cases, is that the creation of an honor is a political act. How we recognize the citizenry in any country, of course, is a government policy. You decide that we will have honors, they will recognize this type of service, they will look like this, etc. However, what he did is that once an honor is created, the politicians take a step back, and the selection of the actual recipients is done at arm's length from the government. So, a committee or a council was created of people that are no politicians sit on this. There are civil servants and representatives of various government offices and colleges and institutions and selected members from within the council, but there are no politicians. And the nominations, once they've been looked at by the council, do not go through the Prime Minister, but are presented directly to the Governor General for approval on behalf of the Queen. Therefore, the Prime Minister is not only consulted, he's not even informed until the awards are approved. This was unique in the 1960s, and it still is quite rare in other countries. In the UK, as you probably know, the honors list, although they now have committees, the honors list still go through the Prime Minister's office. In France, any nomination has to go through a minister to be supported, and still, although some of them probably do it very well, it leaves the perception of political involvement, which taints the honor system because of that process. So in Canada, we made a very conscious decision to try and make clear that the honor system was completely separate from politics. And then the merit-based principle, again, it's what you did, not who you are. Structure has remained very similar to what we knew with the British, where orders, usually multi-leveled, are there to recognize long-term merit. And one can be promoted within the order. One can only be admitted to an order if you're living, because the order itself is not the insignia, it's the people making it. And you can also be kicked out. You can resign from it if you want, but if you do something that is really unsavory, you can be removed from the order. You know, we've had several examples of that with the Order of Canada, and even recently with the Order of Military Merit. Decorations, on the other hand, are awarded to a person, and usually to recognize one single act or meritorious service in a very specific time frame. So it can be gallantry under fire, it can be bravery in the face of danger but not in a combat situation, or meritorious service in a project over a specific initiative or leadership during an operational deployment or something like that. Decorations are awarded, it can be awarded posthumously, can be awarded to Canadian as well as allied military people and foreign recipients, and you can be awarded the same decoration several times which is several awards are represented by bars on the original decoration. Now medals, there are different kinds of medals. The more common ones are the ones we know, campaign medals, to recognize participation in a military operation or a mission overseas, or providing support to such missions. But there are also commemorative medals to commemorate important national anniversary. The last one was the Queen Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012. And of course, there are long service and good conduct medal, not only for the military, but also for the other protective services, like the police, the fire services, emergency services, Coast Guard, prisons, and all of that. So that is the general structure. If we look at the idea of the honor system, it works a bit like a pyramid, where national honors created by the Crown are that, you know, lighter gold at the top of the pyramid, and as you go down, then you have less formal recognition in the form of departmental awards, and then you go down to less formal, and then at the end you have, you know, verbal praise and the good old handshake at the very bottom. And the idea is that as you go closer to the top, the awards are more stringent. It's more difficult to attain, and they're fewer in numbers. But as you go down, you can be a bit more generous, and they should be more easily attainable. With any honor, you always walk a very fine line between not recognizing enough and making the honors appear unattainable, and therefore removing the motivational value from them, and recognizing too much, and of course diluting the value of the honor, again affecting their use as a motivation tool. If everybody's got it, what's the point, really? So you have to walk that fine line between giving enough to encourage people, but not too much that there's a feeling that it becomes meaningless. Recognition is not just to recognize the person, of course. The state has an objective in this. And we did not invent that. You can go to the orders of chivalry in the Middle Ages, and the point of these orders was for the king or the prince to gather around him people, you know, basically give them an honor to ensure their loyalty and, you know, and service around him. And if we push that to the more modern concept, recognition is a basic human need. If you know the Maslow pyramid there with, you know, you have to put a roof on your head and get fed and security and all of this. And as you go down that pyramid to the lesser critical, needs of the humans, you have needs such as recognition. People want to be recognized. They want to stand apart from the mass. That's what explains, you know, fancy cars and tattoos and fancy hairdos and all of that stuff. We don't want to be just like everyone else. We want to be a specific individual. And when the state takes the time physically to identify, mark somebody as distinctive, distinguishing them with an honor, saying this person has done something great, this person is the embodiment of the values the state wants to promote. The aim of the state, of course, is not just to say thank you to that person, it's to motivate others, to try to inspire people to serve in the hope, most likely subconscious, that if they work hard and well like this person, they will too be recognized by the state, and therefore fulfill that need that is very basic for humans. So that's how this works, but like I said, very difficult balance to maintain. And our system, unlike most systems in Europe that have grown over centuries, basically has come from those two elements I mentioned before to this poster in the space of 50 years. So it has grown very quickly, and we have to be still very careful as how we proceed from here. If we look at the modern system, compared to the previous one, this one actually covers all three main streams of individual recognition in terms of valor in combat in the first column, bravery in the face of danger but not in a fighting situation, and then merit. And the lines are level, so the top level is Victoria Cross, Cross of Valor, which is our equivalent to the George Cross, the Order of Military Merit, which is for long-term merit. At level 2, you've got the Star of Military Valor, which replaces things like the DSO, the NC, the NN, and things like that. The Star of Courage, which is our George Medal equivalent, and the Military Service Cross, which would be a bit like the old leadership DSO, and some OBEs and MBEs for deployed operations and other types of service. And then level 3, we have the Medal of Military Valor, which is the equivalent of the NN, DFM, DSC I'm sorry, I think I misspoke there. At level 2, it was DSO, not MC. DSO, DCM, conspicuous gallantry medals, and those types of higher honors. Level 3 is all the crosses, DSC, MC, DFC, and the medals that are equivalent. Medal of Bravery is the equivalent of Queen's Gallantry Medal, and the MSM. Mentioned dispatches has been restored, and of course we have those departmental awards at the bottom that complete the pyramid. So those departmental awards are not honors from the crown, and that is why they are not worn on the ribbons or on the medals. They're worn separately. They're created and awarded within the Canadian Forces for achievements that don't meet the criteria for a national honor. So, how does this work nowadays? The nomination process. Anybody can start a nomination for a Middle East person who's deserving. If we take an example of combat in Afghanistan, for example, maybe the warrant officer witnessed one of his corporals doing something great. He starts the recommendation, but it has to be supported by the CO. So it goes up the chain, supported by the CO, and it's going to make its way up the chain of command at every level. And it was going to go up to what we call a level 1. So these are the command principles. And if they're supported all the way through there, then they're sent to us as the Director of Honors and Recognition. And our job is to make sure that 1, the criteria is met, 2, the action is in line with precedents, and 3, the numerical limits where they are imposed are respected. That's especially vital for deployed operations so that we don't recognize people too much. There are certain quotas that are established for that. And if that is, the 3 questions are answered with a positive, then it goes to the appropriate committee. So either the Order of Military Merit Advisory Council, the Canadian Forces Decorations Advisory Committee, or the Order of St. John Committee. And the Order of Military Merit and the Decorations one are chaired by the CDS himself. So it's General Vance who sits around the table with a 3-stars general around the table, and they decide this. So the chain of command really has ownership of this, and they feel that this is very important, and they take that extremely seriously. It used to be that the Decorations Committee was chaired by somebody much lower in rank, but General Hillier during the Afghan campaign changed that and has brought it right up to the CDS level, and it has remained so ever since. If the council or the committee supports the nomination, then the CDS sends a letter of recommendation directly to the Governor General, who then approves the award through an instrument on behalf of the Queen. We're informed, and then the commander who nominated the person informs the recipient that they have been recognized, and it's published, and eventually the person is invited to Rideau Hall or the Citadel to receive their insignia from the Governor General. So the process can be pretty quick, and we've proven that on some cases. However, usually it takes several months for the process to follow its course and people to receive their recognition. There's great care that is taken to make sure that, because this is not one conflict, we have people all over the place. At the moment, we have operations in Mali, which is peacekeeping. We have a training mission in the Ukraine. We have reassurance forces on land in Latvia, at sea in the Black and the Mediterranean Sea, in the air over Eastern Europe. So we have a number of operations ongoing that are different in nature, but we have to make sure that the recognition is consistent and well balanced between all of these operations as well. So if we look at the specific elements of the honor system, I'm going to briefly cover the main parts that affect the Canadian Armed Forces. The Order of Military Merit was created in 1972, so 5 years after the Order of Canada. Initially, the intent of the Order of Canada was going to be a national order to cover all services, including the military service, a bit like the Légion d'honneur in France. There would be no distinction between a military and a civilian Order of Canada. But like I mentioned, the Order of Canada at the beginning was 1 level with that Medal of Service attached to it. And the numbers were extremely limited. And there had been a drought of civilian recognition since 1919. So for over 50 years, there had been no recognition for the people who actually built Canada to what we knew at the time of the centennial. There was a huge backlog of deserving recipients. And by force, there were very few military people recognized, and the ones that were recognized were usually, top generals with Second World War and Korea service, and not regular serving members of the Canadian Forces. And so pretty much immediately in '67, we started to push to have our own order to be able to recognize people at all rank levels who are not necessarily great generals with Second World War service. And the result was the creation of the Order of Canada, like I said, in 72, with 3 levels: commander, officer, and member. And the level of appointment is related to the level of responsibility of the person. So it's not really rank, although it's usually pretty much parallel. In general, it means that general officers who have strategic effect get the commander level, senior officers have the officer level, and captains and below receive the MMM level. But again, there are exceptions to this. We've had brigadier generals who've been made officers. We've had, captains who've been made officers, and majors who've been members, and these types of iterations. What has been important also is to make sure that the order is representative of the Canadian Armed Forces. And we've had some struggles. At the beginning, it actually worked quite well. We had very a wide array of ranks represented in the order, and people with many different types of service, and younger people being appointed. In the very first list in 1972, there were 12 people on the list that did not even have their CD. So they didn't even have 12 years of service, and they were appointed to the Order of Mediterranean. We don't see that nowadays, in part because since 72, of course, we've created a range of other decorations to recognize specific activities, and the order is very much limited to a career of deserving service. But still, the years of service have moved up, and some of the ranks are no longer as well represented as they used to be. So in recent years, there's been an effort to try to make sure that when we look on CPAC, the ceremony at Rideau Hall, of people going forward to pick up their insignia, it is a reflection of the Canadian Forces. In terms of years of service, in terms of trades, in terms of gender, in terms of languages, reserve versus regular force, and all of that. And we've made progress on many fields, but there's still some efforts to be done in this. I should mention, in 72, this is when the Order of Canada was modified to go to the 3 levels that we know now. So the companion was retained. Those who had received the Medal of Service, who always felt a bit like second-class citizens, because of course the companion had this gold enameled with jewel, stones in the crown and all of that, beautiful neck badge, and the Medal of Service was sort of a silver snowflake, much small, no enamel, no stones, no nothing. So they sort of felt a bit left out when sometimes the achievements were very significant still. And so all of the recipients of the Medal of Service became officers of the Order of Canada, nice neck badge, enamel, and everything. Just slightly smaller than the companions, and with a gold maple leaf instead of a red one. And then the new level of member was introduced as the 3rd level. And that's when also the Medal of Courage, which had never been awarded, was scrapped. The military valor decorations. These are actually the latest addition to the family of decorations because they were not created until 1993. And the very simple reason for that was that for the main part, we had no use of them. After the Korean War, of course, Canada, with Lester B. Pearson and the first UNEF in Egypt, we led with peacekeeping. We were not doing a lot of war fighting, and therefore people were saying, so what about the VC? We've created the Order of Canada, and as we will see later, we've created a range of bravery decorations. What about gallantry decorations? And people were sort of brushing that question aside, saying, well, we're not at war, and there's no prospect of us going to war, so let's not worry about that too much. And the veterans associations, in particular, were concerned about the possibility of using the Victoria Cross still in Canada. And, various governments made some statements. Some people said, yeah, it's still possible for Canada to make recommendations, and the Royal Warrants for the VC actually mentioned that. But at one point, Prime Minister Trudeau, the first, mentioned that, Canadians should really get Canadian decorations, but left it at that without any further details. In the 1980s, the Legion managed to convince Prime Minister Mulroney that really the Victoria Cross should be the top Canadian honor for gallantry. But then again, it sort of fizzled away. There was no real need there. But in the background at National Defense, they started to create a proposal to have gallantry decorations. They said, yeah, there's no war, but if one comes, we have to be prepared and have something in place as opposed to trying to rush at the last minute. So they tried to develop a proposal to create Canadian gallantry decorations. And initially the Rideau Hall was saying, well, we can just use the bravery decorations and maybe we can put like crossed swords on a ribbon or something like that. But the military, the chain of command, was saying absolutely not. Gallantry under fire in a combat situation is quite distinct from demonstrating bravery in other circumstances, like running into a burning house or jumping in a fast-flowing river to save somebody. And he said, we need distinct declarations to recognize that difference. And so, despite what the Prime Minister had stated publicly to the Legion about the Victoria Cross, it looks like this small part of information was lost on national defense, and he immediately went forward with a proposal for 3 brand new Canadian decorations: a medal, a star, and a cross, but similar to the Cross of Valor, so a neck badge with, in the same shape, different colors, but it was going to call the Cross of Canada or the Canada Cross. The name evolved with time. And so that's the proposal that progressed. And then happened the Gulf War. So for the first time since Korea, Canada is at war. And we have planes bombing targets, and we have troops on the grounds and ships at sea, and this is a war. And conveniently enough, in early February of 1991, as we were in the thick of it, after 2 weeks that the actual war part has started, at the end of January, front page news of the Globe and Mail, Victoria Cross to be ditched, to be replaced by a new Canadian, cross of Canada Cross or something like that. And of course, there was a huge uproar. Not only veterans and the Legion, but also civic organizations like the Monarchist League of Canada, historians, veterans of any stripe were quite upset at this new proposal, which of course went directly against what the Prime Minister had previously stated. And so initially the government said, no, we're going to go ahead with this, there's no problem here, and try to carry on. But eventually, this did not fly because the volume of the criticism just kept rising. However, the Gulf War, as you know, didn't last very long, and by March, the combat part of that was over, and the problem sort of went away, and the government just put this on the back burner quietly, and hoping that the problem would go away. The trouble is that one of their own MPs, a Conservative, had put a motion in Parliament to restore the Victoria Cross, and that made its way through Parliament. And as time went by, the MP, McPhee, actually managed to convince people of all parties to support this idea of keeping the Victoria Cross as Canada's top level. And of course, it would have been slightly problematic for the government to have one of their own MPs put a motion, have it succeed in Parliament. And of course, honours are not created usually by acts of Parliament. It's done by the royal prerogative on the recommendation of the government. And so the Prime Minister essentially directed the Honours Policy Committee to have a second look at this proposal, which, if you read between the lines, made it pretty clear what needed to be done, and the Victoria Cross was back in. So, a Victoria Cross for Canada, very much following what the Australians had just done in 1991, in keeping the same physical decoration, but having it created by the Queen of Australia under Australian regulations to be approved by Australian authorities alone. And so we did essentially the same thing, created a Victoria Cross for Canada, the second level with the star, and the third level with the medal. We also created in 1991, that one managed to get through in the Gulf War, a modern equivalent of the mentioned dispatches. Now, the only difference, of course, with the Victoria Cross for Canada is that design is slightly different than the original. Generally speaking, it looks the same, but the motto, which was only in English, for Valor, on the original one, was changed in a last-minute change to the Latin equivalent Pro Valore. Because somebody said, well, if we're going through all this effort to make this decoration Canadian, given the current laws in Canada, it would be a bit weird to have an unilingual motto on it. And so that small change was made at the last minute, and the Queen quite readily agreed to that. Of course, the manufacturer is quite distinct as well. I could give you another presentation on that, but we would be here for a long time, so we'll skip that. Of course, the criteria for those, it has to be gallantry in combat in the face of an armed enemy, which means that these cannot be used in a peacekeeping context. Because in a peacekeeping context, although there are sometimes bullets flying, and for the people on the ground it does look like war at times, in theory, There are no armed enemies in a peacekeeping context. There are conflicting parties. And our job as armed forces is not to be there to destroy them as a valid fighting entity, but is to be there to interpose ourselves between forces that have agreed to our presence to make sure that we implement, agreements or UN Security Council resolutions or an armistice of some kind, or facilitate peace building. So, in peacekeeping context, we use other decorations like the Bravery ones. The mentioned dispatch can be used for peacekeeping, and of course the military service decorations. But those ones are strictly reserved for combat operations. So of course the Gulf War was long over by the time they were created, and they were used for the first time during the Afghanistan campaign. So we had about 40,000 people served during that 13-year mission in Afghanistan, and we awarded 20 stars of military valor and 89 medals of military valor during that time. And when you read the citations of those recipients, they are very, very impressive indeed. The awards can be made posthumously, and there have been a few of those. The awards can also be made to Allied members serving under our command. And in fact, 3 American soldiers were recognized, 1 with a star and 2 with the medal in Afghanistan as well. Compared to the British system, all of our decorations are rank and service neutral. So regardless if you're Air Force, Navy, or Army, an officer or an NCM, the only thing that directs which decoration you're going to get is the level of gallantry that has been displayed. That's all. There are numerical limits, and in a war situation like Afghanistan or Iraq at the moment, the limit is 1 nomination per 250 people under command for every period of 6 months, which is exactly the same quota, if you wish, that was used during the Second World War and in Korea for British gallantry decorations. So we kept that tradition. And in that picture there, that's Sergeant Patrick Tower, who was the very first recipient of the Star of Military Valor, announced in 2006 and presented in February of 2007 here at the Château Laurier in Ottawa. So this is the structure for gallantry, and you have next to it what it replaced in the British system. And of course we have the addition of the commendations, which are used in a very flexible manner to recognize either a lower level of gallantry, a lower level of bravery, or even a lower level of military service. So it serves as a basically junior version of all the basic decorations. Bravery decorations, so those are not for combat, and these are not specifically military. These are open to any Canadian who put their own lives at risk, knowingly, in order to save or attempt to save somebody. Created in 1972, replacing the impractical Medal of Courage, which had never been awarded. So it existed in theory between 67 and 72. And it was quickly obvious that it was not practical to recognize all levels of bravery with one honor. So that one was abolished, those 3 were introduced, and one thing that really pushed the introduction of those was the Kootenay incident. HMCS Kootenay had this devastating engine room explosion, several people got killed, and a number of gallantry acts took place there, and the very first Cross of Valor, I don't know about the Cross of Valor, but Stars of Courage, yes, and there were Crosses of Valor issued there as well. The very first recipients were for the Kootenay. That was in '69, so it still took 3 years to push through the system the creation of those decorations. So far, 20 Crosses of Valor have been issued in 45 plus years. Over 400 now stars and well over 3,000 medals of bravery have been awarded. And here you have the picture of one of our last CF recipient. This is now Chief Warrant Officer Mitchell, Cross of Valor, member of the Order of Military Merit, recipient of the Military Service Medal for good measure. Great chap, Sartek. And he and his colleague, now Chief Warrant Officer Piers, who was also a member of the Order of Military and recipient of the Military Service Cross, also for good measure, both earned the cross back in 1998 for a very daring night parachute rescue in the Arctic Ocean. Again, a hair-raising citation if there is one. Military Service decorations, 2 levels, a cross and a medal. And these are, if the Order of Military Merit recognizes long-term merit, these are basically short-term merit. So it is, we say, from 5 minutes to 5 years. So it can be one single action, or it can be military service going above and beyond what is expected of somebody in a certain rank, certain position, with a certain expertise, for a project, an operational rotation, a tour of duty here in Canada, but they can be used for that. And again, unlike the OMM, the level of award is only based on the impact of the merit on a person. So a private can get the cross and a full general can get the medal, and this has happened. And recently, again, we had a corporal and a master seaman and a war officer getting the cross, and we have, 3-star generals getting the medal, and that's exactly what it's supposed to be. The cross was instituted in '84 to be a sort of a fill gap between the Order of Military Merit and the newly created CDS Commendation, which was created in 1974. And then the NSM was added in '91 when it was quickly realized that there was not enough flexibility to recognize the levels of recognition. But so far, this has worked very well. We've awarded, we are over 230 crosses, and we're well over 850 medals in the military division. In 1991, when the medal was created, there's also an equivalent civil division that was created that is being used again now after a sort of a gap of about 10 years, but it's being awarded now. Chris Hatfield, for example, is the only Canadian who earned the NSC both in the military division. His first flight in space was as a colonel, military, got an NSC, and his flight, the Qatar one a few years ago, as a civilian, he got the NSC in the civil division. It's the only Canadian who wears the 2 NSCs with the 2 different ribbons. We have some interesting combinations. We have people who have the cross and the medal. We have somebody here, Colonel Saint-Cyr, the group that's in the middle, who received the NSM 3 times. So 2 bars on the NSM. We now have somebody who has the cross, the medal, and a bar to the medal. So very interesting combinations that are coming up here. This Captain, I forget his name, Aaron, I think. He was a helicopter pilot, and you can see there barely on his chest, on the same day he received both the cross and the medal. And these 2 are his first medals on his uniform for distinct, separate flight missions, usually involving rescues and things like that. So that was quite impressive. And of course, up top right is Captain Goddard, the first female killed in combat in Canadian history, in the combat arms. And she received an NSM, a posthumous NSM for her service in Afghanistan. Departmental Awards, I'm going to go over this very quickly. Like I said, created within the department. There's one from the Chief of Defense Staff, which is gold since 1974, for anything that basically falls short of a national honor. And below it, in 1995, was added a command commendation. These are awarded by 10 authorized commanders, like the commander of the Army or the chief military personnel, for achievements that reflect well on the command itself. We have the CF Medallion for Distinguished Service, which is like an equivalent for civilian recipients that contribute to the Canadian Forces. Casualty recognition has been transformed tremendously because of the Afghan campaign. Of course, I've already mentioned the Memorial Cross created in 1919. That one had to be changed, because 1919 is a long time ago, and the construct of a family and the value we put on life has evolved a great deal in 100 years. Of course, it was focused back then 2 crosses maximum, widow if the person was married, and mother if she was still alive when the member died. Well, we found ourselves in Afghanistan with a Captain Goddard who did not have a widow. She had a widower, and the regulations prevented us from giving him the cross. Well, that made no sense. We had situations where people no longer had a mother and a wife. They had a same-sex partner, or they have reconstituted families, and it just did not line up with the reality. And we had increasingly, well, why just the mother and widow? What about the father or the husband? And so what was decided was to increase the number from 2 to 3, so that one could recognize their spouse and parents, whatever they may be. But also, we're not going to say the parent and the spouse are going to be the recipients. We're going to let the members pick who they want. Who are we to decide who will suffer most if something unfortunate happens to you? So now, as part of the administration, like you fill their will and who you have to advise if something bad happens. You fill a form to say who are the 3 people that should get the cross if something bad happens. And that's the way it works now. We also created in 2012 the Memorial Ribbon. So only 3 crosses often leaves other people in the family that are closely affected without recognition. And it was desired, especially for children, to have a small memento. And the ribbon came to fill that gap, and up to 5 are granted to the families, usually to children. The memorial scroll was a tradition, a British tradition of the First World War that all Canadian fallen of the Great War received. We did not use the British equivalent for the Second World War or the Korean War, but we sort of created a new Canadian version in 2009 for all deaths from 2001 onwards. We actually went to the effort of scanning an original First World War scroll from a collection at the War Museum. Using a special program, we created a font, because this was not a font like you have Times New Roman in your computer. This was actually a poem, or a text that was written by the poet laureate at the time, and it was actually calligraphy and then made into a printing block. It's not a font that exists. So we actually made the font using the letters from the original text and retyped a new text to match, trying to respect the spirit of the wording as much as possible while adapting it, of course, to our needs. And the format as well, with the Royal Arms and the cipher, was emulated from the original. The memorial bar was something that was created by Canada during the Second World War, because unlike during the First World War, Second World War campaign medals were not engraved with the name of the recipient. And this was particularly offensive to the families of the fallen, who after the war, several years after the war, in 47, 48, 49, received a box of medals with loose ribbons with no names on them. And that was the testament, you know, to their fallen family member. And there was a lot of pressure in Parliament. And of course, we issued millions of medals in the Second World War. We had 1.1 million people in uniform in the Second World War, all of whom qualified for 2 to 6, 7, 8 medals each. Recalling all those, naming them with the potential errors and reshipping them was just something that was not really practical or economical. So it was decided that for the fallen, we would create this bar that could be affixed to a frame or a picture to commemorate the deceased. And those were issued for the Second World War. And a few years back, I was talking to my colleagues at VAC, and they said, we found this whole box of stuff cleaning up a vault here. And they had found a whole box of blank memorial bars from the Second World War. And they wanted to get rid of it. I said, no, I'll take this, thank you very much. And so from 2001, we basically restored the tradition, and we still grant the memorial bar to the families now. And of course, the big change was the sacrifice medal, introduced, announced in 2008 and launched in 2009 to recognize all those that are wounded by hostile action or die as a result of military service. So the posthumous aspect is actually broader than the combat. Anybody who died because of their military service, could be a disease or an accident or anything like that, are covered by the medal. But the living aspect of the medal is really a combat award, equivalent of the wound stripe that we had before. Has to be the direct result of hostile action, has to be serious enough to be required for written by MO, and has to be documented. And it covers both physical and psychological wounds. In the modern Canadian forces, visible and invisible wounds are considered equal and are equally eligible for that medal, so long, of course, as they meet the same criteria. Medals, I'm going to go again very quickly over this, recognize campaign and operational service, and we've created a whole range of those medals now to recognize the various types of service. You know, in combat with an armed enemy, operations that are sort of peacekeeping or where there's still a level of risk, and then sort of the lower risk medal or operational support for operations, the special service medal. Commemorative medals, I've already mentioned, the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, and of course our Canadian Forces Decoration, which is our long service medal. So I went slightly over time here, and I was talking faster and faster. I hope you were able to follow. But I only hope to give you a brief overview of the system, how it evolved, and how it is used now. It is hugely important for any military force to recognize their members. It is part of the leadership toolbox to make sure the morale is strong, the esprit de corps is solid, because that has a direct impact on the operational effectiveness of your force. And the CDS and the leadership of Canadian forces are very insistent that this be a strong system and that it be used appropriately and that recognition be provided in a timely fashion. You know, I mentioned Second World War, people had to wait until 1948 and 49 to get their medals. Right now, you deploy to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to the Ukraine or to Latvia, you will get your medal with your name engraved on it in theater from your commander before you come back to Canada. So that's how timely recognition has become important, and that's how we try to recognize our people. So I hope this was useful, and I'm willing to take any questions you may have. Yes?
You talked about the meetings that are held with the the senior generals at them?
Yeah.
How often does that happen in a year?
So the Order of Military Merit Council meets only once a year. It's a one-year cycle. But the Canadian Forces Decorations Advisory Council meets every 2 months, except in summer. So it's usually 5 times a year. So we had a meeting just in early February, and the next one is 10 April. So it is fairly frequent, and the number of files depends, of course, on the operational tempo. It can go from 10 to 12 files. At the last meeting we had 17, and sometimes it's 35, 40 files. So yeah, so that's the frequency of the meetings. The lower awards, like I mentioned in dispatches and the departmental awards, don't go to a committee. Once they've gone through all the levels, they get to me at DHNR. We look, if it meets, criteria, quota, precedent, we send it straight to the CES and he says yes or no, and that's that. It's a commendation, it's not the VC, so we have to, again, to try to make things timelier, we try to make the system a bit more streamlined for the lower awards. I'm going to try to keep this brief because this is a very interesting story and a very complex one. As you probably know, the Victoria Cross is made from gunmetal. The legend has it that the original Victoria Cross was made from guns captured from the Russians at Sebastopol. And we know the metal used for the crosses from 1856 to 1914 was consistently from the same source, although we don't really know what that source was, but we can presume maybe that the history is correct. In 1914, that source ran out. And since then, the British VC has been made, almost all of them, from guns that are Chinese in origin. We don't know where they came from. And they cut the cascabel at the back, which is that sort of bulbous protrusion where you put the recoil cables around. So they cut those, and the VCs have been made out of those 2 cascabels since 1914, except for a brief period in 1943 when the stock had been moved because of Luftwaffe bombing, but that, of course, was not publicized for fear to give the Luftwaffe a propaganda coup. And they used another source of metal for a short period of time, but it was found again in a different depot and all went back to normal. So, when Canada created its Victoria Cross, initially the intent was to do exactly like the Australians and say, yes, we've changed the model, but we're going to use the same metal, have it made in the UK by Hancock's, the jewelers who've made them all since 1856, same casting method, everything else. However, this was 1993, 94, 95. We get into the Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin era of big budget cuts to try to put Canada back into the black. And everybody suffered, including the Chancellery of Honours, and their budget was slashed. And there was no immediate need for the Victoria Cross just then. The Gulf War was over, so again, it was pushed to the back. It's only in the early 2000s that the topic about, okay, this exists on paper since 1993, maybe we have to make some. And of course, the pressure increased substantially when we got involved in Afghanistan because now we were in combat. And so the topic of manufacture came around. And of course, we at D&D said, okay, the plan was that then, in 93, let's go to the Brits, have it made, same thing. But the mood had changed in the government in those intervening years, and it was a strong desire that the Victoria Cross be made in Canada of Canadian metals. And of course, we didn't know there was a firm in Canada that could make the Victoria Cross to the specifications that we wanted. And of course, Canadian metals, what would that be? All sorts of ideas floated from using, guns captured at Vimy, which of course are steel and not bronze. You can't cast things on the steel to make metals, it just doesn't work. Some people said, well, let's use, one of those ties from the railway, the last spike, the Great Railway. But of course, that's steel again, and not bronze. And of course, most of those railways in 1885 were manufactured by Krupp, the German company that made a lot of the armament that killed our soldiers in the 2 World Wars. So the symbolics was not ideal. Somebody said, well, Victoria Cross, Queen Victoria, in a museum in Quebec City, there's that statue that we could use parts of, but it had been blown up by the FLQ, so that didn't fly. Somebody said, well, maybe we could use the bell from the Peace Tower, the original Victoria Tower, that burned down in 1916. The bell crashed down, it's behind Parliament Building. Maybe we can use parts of that. Again, there were some, of course, issues with heritage with that. And the government was insistent that it had to be purely Canadian material. And we at D&D, I went to the Canadian, I said, listen, I can understand the Canadian component, but a lot of the mystique of the original Victoria Cross is linked to what it's made out of. There's that aura, that history, that patina that you cannot manufacture. You know, if you wanted so Canadian, are you going to carve it out of moose antler and dip it in maple syrup? You know, I don't know what you're going to make it out of. But I said, whatever you do, it has to have at least part of that original metal. Otherwise, we don't want it. And that gave them some pause, of course, because we're the clients, we're the Canadian Forces, and we said, okay, good Canadian, but we have to preserve the history and the link to the 81 or 95, depending on how you count, Canadians who've earned that decoration before and that we're using as examples. So, in the end, what I suggested is that, okay, we're going to do the usual Canadian compromise. We're going to mix things. We're going to ask the Queen of the United Kingdom if she'd be willing to give to the Queen of Canada a piece of the original gunmetal, and the two queens agreed very quickly. And then we're going to mix that with metal of a Canadian source. What was that going to be after all the silly ideas that we had? Some of them were mine too, but we decided to, and that's the designer of the VC, Bruce Beattie, there, and that's the sample up there of what the Cross of Canada would have looked like, essentially a Cross of Valor enameled white. But that's the final design approved by the Queen, designed by Bruce, there on the left with approved Elizabeth R. And that's the central element redesigned by Cathy Bursay-Sabret of the Chancery of Honours back in the 2000s when we actually proceeded with the manufacturing. And that up there was an early idea of the ribbons made by D&D when the first ideas were thrown around in 1990 or something like that. Inspired by the DFC, obviously. So, here we have it. I decided, because I was discussing this with Chris McCreary, some of you may know him, important honors historian in Canada, has written about 15 books on this stuff. And we were discussing this in my office in Uplands. And I happened to have a Confederation medal on my desk. I said, what about this? Confederation medal, I know there's about 30 of them left that have never been awarded since 1867 in a vault at Canadian Heritage. This was, it's not an honor per se, but it was created by the government of Canada to mark Confederation. As Queen Victoria on the front, you know, Victoria Cross, was paid by the government of Canada to symbolize the birth of our nation. What about we take one from Canadian Heritage and we mix it with the original British medal, which is the slice that we got there in that triangular piece. And that idea worked, but the government insisted that we also have, or the committee I should say, that we also have a modern aspect, because the Confederation medal is 67, it's the birth of Canada. It was still made in the UK by Pinches. They wanted to have something like materially Canadian in there, and so we added a third element, which is metal mined or naturally found in Canada, so tin and lead and things like that. From all the regions of Canada were represented, and Natural Resources Canada provided that to us. And so these are the three components mixed together, created the Victoria Cross alloy, which was dubbed the Rideau alloy. And the Victoria Cross, the last thing we wanted was to go to tender, you know, and the lowest bidder was going to make the Victoria Cross for Canada and be able to say on their website, you know, we made this, and we did not want that. And we were also very concerned that, you know, the security of the dyes and the metal, we were also concerned about the quality and the workmanship. We didn't know if anybody was going to be able to make this. And in the end, after a lot of research, we found out that we, the government, can actually make this. The Mint can make the tooling, can finish it, and Natural Resources Canada can do casting. And so that's what happened. Because we wanted to make it the same way as the original, by casting and not by striking. You know, metals are usually struck with dyes. The Victoria Cross, because of the poor quality of the original metal, has always been cast in sand molds. We didn't go to sand molds, we went to ceramic molds, but we still went to casting. And so you have the various designs and the dyes to make the wax seals, and then to make the wax tree, which is then embedded into plaster. The plaster is heated to harden it. It's the lost wax process. And so you heat it up, the wax goes, it leaves a cavity, which is a negative with the Victoria Cross, and then you pour the Rideau alloy into the hole, and then you get a Victoria Cross tree, and then you cut it and finish it and patinate it, and there you have a Victoria Cross. Oops. So that was a short version of the answer. That's what the Victoria Cross is made out of. 3 metals: VC metal, Confederation metal, and Canadian metal.